Hello and welcome into another episode of Lessons in Product Management. I'm your host, John Fontenot, and this is brought to you by Path to Product. So, if you're not subscribed to the YouTube channel and you're currently listening to this on the audio podcast, I would strongly suggest you go over to the Path to Product YouTube channel, Path number 2 Product YouTube channel, because we have a slideshow for this one, and I think it just complements the audio very well. And there's a lot of good content coming to the YouTube channel as well. On top of that, there's free courses. We're going to talk about product strategy today. So if you want to learn more about developing product strategy, or if you're an aspiring PM looking to gain experience in product, I have another course that kind of walks you through step by step of the product management process from discovery to delivery and gives you an opportunity to practice and package that up as a portfolio project. So a lot of great opportunities, all for free on the Path to Product YouTube channel. Today we're going to talk about what's wrong with OKRs and why OKRs don't replace strategy. Now, don't get me wrong. I've read Measure What Matters by John Doerr. I'm a certified OKR coach as of recently. And I like OKRs. I think they have value. I think they're good, but they're not a silver bullet and they're not strategy. And I hear too many people conflate the two together. They say, oh yeah, your objectives is the what you're trying to do and the KRs is the how. And typically the how bleeds in with strategy. So people get confused. And I want to try to separate those two things and show how they complement each other, but how OKRs are not a substitute for strategy in and of itself. Okay. So what are OKRs? So I'm moving my video over here. So sorry for the break in the audio. All right. What are OKRs? So to break those down, if you haven't heard of them, try to make it really simple. Objectives are simply qualitative and inspirational goals that are to be met in the next 12 to 18 months. Okay. So you have a time horizon of 12 to 18 months, and they are qualitative in nature. They're not measurable, right, by definition, and they're supposed to be inspirational, right? And we'll go over an example of what that looks like, or what that could have looked like if prior presidents had used OKRs. A key result is typically done quarterly. They are quantitative and measurable, and it indicates directional effectiveness, right? So on a quarterly basis, you're trying to measure certain key results that, if achieved at a decent enough percentage, quarter over quarter, will get you to your objective 12 to 18 months from now. All right. So what do OKRs lack, right? Let's use an example to kind of break it down. All right. So objectives supposed to be inspirational and qualitative. Think back to the early 60s, 1961. If you were alive then, great. I wasn't. A lot of you aren't, based on the stats that I get on the podcast. But that's okay. Most people are familiar with the United States' mission to the moon, kind of in that race with Russia back in the day. And the president at the time said that our objective is to put a man on the moon and get him back safely before the end of this decade. And as we all know, 1969, it happened. But if you were in NASA at that point in time and you heard the president say, we're going to put a man on the moon and get him back before the end of this decade, and you're trying to think, okay, we're a few decades early on this whole, actually a couple decades since Intel I think popularized it in the 80s. Anyway, sidebar, apologies. If you were trying to do OKRs at NASA at this time and you heard the objective from your president and you were thinking, okay, it is May, we're in Q2, because that's when the speech was given. What's going to be my Q3 key result? If it was me, I'd be like, where do we even start, right? And to me, that's what OKRs lack, is without a strategy and without something to deliver focus within the broader organization. If you think about it, there's a lot of things that we could start putting into action to try to help put a man on the moon and get him back safely. You could start building stuff. You could start researching. You could start training, like recruiting and training astronauts for the missions. There's a lot of different things you could do, but what should you be doing? Strategy would tell you that. Okay, so what are the elements of a good strategy? Okay, so you see you have the objective here, right? And if you're on the audio podcast, again, you can't see it. So I'm going to try my best to visually represent or audibly represent the visual elements here. So if you look at the first piece and the last piece, they look familiar. Objective, key results, right? Right. So you have the objective, which is the aspirational, inspirational, or qualitative goal, right? So strategy does include that. You need something to anchor your strategy to, your objective. But then you have the diagnosis of your challenge, right? Any goal inherently has a challenge to get there. If there was no challenge, you could easily hit the goal, right? But inspirational, aspirational objectives will always have a challenge. And having a proper diagnosis of what this is really, really helps, right? So you have to define and explain the nature of the challenge, blocking progress towards your goal before you have any hope of overcoming that challenge to get to your objective. All right, and this middle part that we're going through here in between the OKR section comes from a book called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy by Richard Rumelt, strategy professor at UCLA. He calls it the kernel in his book, these three elements. There's a lot more that he goes in depth for. But in terms of product strategy development and strategy development, this is really the core or the kernel that you have to pull out of it. So that's why we're coupling this with OKRs to bring a holistic picture. Okay, so you have objectives, you defined and diagnosed the key challenge in the way of your objective, and next you need a guiding policy, right? So if I'm trying to get to NASA, I know what my goal is, right? And maybe we've defined what the core challenge is in the way of that. Now we need something to focus, right? How are we going to approach overcoming this challenge? Because again, you might know what the challenge is, but different parts of NASA might be trying to overcome their own definition of what the challenge is, or their own way of trying to overcome it in their functional group, right? And if there's not cohesion, then you're not going to have effective and efficient operations internally. And speaking of coherent actions, that's the next piece, right? So once you've kind of defined the approach you're going to take, then the actions that each individual in the organization is now empowered to do is to make decisions through the lens of that guiding policy that is now constraining everyone's focus, right? And then lastly, your key results, okay? So we have the objective, we know what challenges in our way, we have a guiding policy to frame our focus and our actions. We've identified what actions we need to take, and then based on all those things, there are key results that we expect, quantitative measures of success that when achieved should mean you've reached your objective, or at least the next milestone towards it. Okay, so that's the elements of a good strategy. Let's go back to the NASA example and talk about how OKRs complement but not replace strategy. So thinking about NASA, the objective is to put a man on the moon and get him back before the end of this decade, right? A little bit of a measurement there, but again, they weren't completely following OKRs, so forgive the president back then for not being completely qualitative in nature. The key challenge, right? And I'm making this up, but I was actually thinking about this earlier today, and I'm like, man, if I was like the head of NASA, right? Thank goodness I'm not. But if I was, in like the 10 minutes I put thinking about this, what would the challenge be in my mind? Is it building a spacecraft? Is it training astronauts? Is it, landing on the moon? And I started thinking about it and like going back to the objective, right? Put a man on the moon and get him back safely. Both of these objectives imply that you have to land and you have to take off. In order to land and take off, what are you landing on and what are you taking off from, right? So I diagnosed the key challenge as we have no clue what the moon's surface is like, right? And they might have back then, but they probably put a lot more focus on trying to diagnose what the moon's surface is like back in the early 60s as they were thinking about landing, right? Because what point is it to start building a spacecraft and start running all these crazy mathematical formulas and calculations of how are we going to take off and what's the trajectory and blah, 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 when all of that would get derailed if you built the wrong spacecraft for landing and taking off? Because I would guess, and maybe this is a faulty assumption, but I would guess that based on the type of spacecraft you needed to land on the moon and take off, it would indicate or implicate the type of materials you would need on the spacecraft, and a lot of other variables too, right? And that would impact all these mathematical equations and formulas that go into launching this thing into space and getting it back from the moon. So I hope it's a reasonable, educated guess at what the key challenge diagnosis would be. All right, moving on. So we have the objective, we have a key challenge that we have no clue what the moon's surface is like. So what would a guiding policy be like for NASA, right? If we know what the key challenge is about the moon's surface? Well, we need to mitigate the risk of an unknown landing and launch surface, right? They may never know for sure with absolute certainty. And in product management, there's a lot of things that we won't know for sure with complete certainty, especially if we're dealing with aspirational objectives, right? So a lot of what we do is mitigate the risk. So this kind of nicely correlates there. But they should mitigate the risk of an unknown landing and launch surface. So what might some actions be, right? Gather the world's best scientists, identify necessary equipment and resources, maybe do some testing on different types of surfaces, and maybe a best guess, maybe get your geologist and try to come up with, well, what are the known elements in the world and all this different variables, and like what might the moon be made of, and how old do we think the universe is, how much space dust is on the moon, and all these other things. I think I heard something about space dust measurement in regards to landing on the moon. So again, another aside, but those are examples of coherent actions, right? If you're trying to mitigate the risk of an unknown landing and launch surface, you probably want geologists talking about minerals and rocks and different things you might be landing on. You probably need equipment and resources to do testing and experiments. And you probably need some of the world's best scientists in the room to help come up with different ways we can mitigate risk, right? And so key results. So this was Q2 in May when the president issued this decree, so to speak. So key results might be by the end of Q3, we want all of our findings from the research we've done about the moon, from our best conjecture about the surface, yada, yada. We want all those findings documented by the end of Q3, 1961. And we want 90% of all NASA employees to have read these documents by the end of the year, 1961. Okay. So that's, these key results span across a couple of quarters. So it's not exactly OKR perfection, but we could easily make this, we want all the findings documented by the end of Q3, and we could change this to say all employees have read the documents by end of Q3. Okay, and then now we're compliant with OKRs. But the point is that you probably wouldn't have come to findings are documented by end of Q3 and all NASA employees have read the documents by end of Q3 or end of the year, unless you had determined first what the key challenge was, put some focus around how you were going to overcome that challenge, and then develop some coherent actions, right? You would have been left with too big of a problem space to really know where to begin if you were any employee or any leader inside of NASA. And if you did have an idea, your ideas would have probably been different than your colleagues across the aisle. Okay, so here's a good example of OKRs plus the strategy kernel in terms that might be a little more familiar than NASA unless you're kind of in that domain. So this is something that I took on for Path to Product as an example, OKR with the strategy kernel, right? So our objective, and this is kind of made up, but pretty close to spot on. Our objective is to be nationally recognized by product leaders as the first place to look for junior product talent. Okay. I say this, but I've been going through multiple minimum viable products iterations. I'm on iteration number 4 that I'll be building out this year in 2022. But the goal would be by the end of 2022 to be nationally recognized. Nationally, I'm in the US, so it'd be limited to the US. Nationally recognized by product leaders as the first place to look for junior product talent would be our objective. Now, this is where things get a little bit interesting, right? Because if key results are quarter over quarter, how do you know what to align your key results to for Q1? in a phased manner to get to a 12 to 18 month objective. That part's always been a little bit weird to me and feels like a little bit of a gap. So what I've done, kind of stepping outside of the formal OKR training, is saying, why not have a quarterly objective as almost like a milestone to the 12 to 18 month objective? Makes it a lot more tangible and easy to kind of work through as you're developing strategy, right? So your objective in the strategy kernel, in this instance, right, what is the first objective or first milestone to getting to nationally recognized marketplace for junior product talent? One is find an acceptable alternative to experience. If the key blocker from the research I've done for aspiring PMs is they don't have experience, well, they can't get it unless they get a job, or there's an acceptable alternative to experience, right? So our objective would be to find that. So the guiding policy would be, how do we constrain our approach, or sorry, I forgot about the challenge, right? So diagnose the challenge. So what would be the challenge? The challenge would be to find the key set of skills that, and I'm making this up off the cuff, but find the key set of skills that range true no matter what industry, or maybe you could frame it this way. I don't know what the core skills of a junior PM is, regardless of industry or geography, right? So that could be a good diagnosis of the challenge. So the guiding policy would be, everything I do is going to be working towards identifying the key skills that recruiters and hiring managers expect junior or associate PMs to have and be able to do on the job, right? So that would be the Q1 objective. That's the diagnosis of the challenge and the guiding policy. And then the key results, right? For Q1, you might be thinking, well, what's the actions? Well, I'll fill that in just a second. If you're looking at the slides, you can already see them. But the Q1 key results, there's two, right? Interview 25 product leaders by the end of January, and interview 25 tech recruiters by the end of January, right? Recruiters that recruit for product managers. All right, so those are quantitative. They have a measure of how much we're doing by when. So 2x, from X to Y by when, kind of that formula. And then if you look here under each key result, there's some coherent actions, right? We need to build an interview guide, right? If we're going to interview these product leaders and these tech recruiters, they're probably going to be different interview guides, asking slightly different questions to get to the same type of insight. And then we're going to identify 25 diverse product leaders. I put PLs here. Then we're going to recruit them and interview them, synthesize their insights on an opportunity solution tree, if you're familiar with Teresa Torres's model on continuous discovery. And then we're going to quantify themes by the number of times that they were mentioned by the product leader, right? And then same thing for the tech recruiter, build an interview guide, identify 25 tech recruiters, recruit them, interview them, and so on and so forth. And then you'll have a nice map on two sides and be able to see across pretty easily, like, what are the common themes of key skills and job responsibilities of a junior or an associate PM, right? And that would be, your OKRs for Q1. Q2 might be figure out how to, create an experience where you can get tangible experience of these skills, right? How do you replicate these skills in practice before the individual is actually on the job on somebody's dime, right? Okay, so all that, hopefully I didn't lose you on these examples, but the point is that if you don't have a diagnosis of your challenge, a good guiding policy to constrain your focus, and then coherent actions, you really have a gap in your OKRs to where you might have an objective, right? Be nationally recognized by product leaders is the first place to look for junior product talent. If I had a marketing department, they might be like, oh, we got to build our brand and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, no, we need you to help with market research, because we could have third-party data helping out with this too. You could be helping us in the recruitment of these product leaders. You can be coming and building case studies with us that you later turn into marketing collateral, etc. Like, there's other things that you could be doing, but you wouldn't be on the same page unless you identified the diagnosis of your challenge, and the guiding policy, right? So it's all about identifying the skills. And so everything that your organization should be doing, if you're a part of Path to Product in this instance, is around identification of key skills of junior product managers. So I hope that's helpful. I hope you're not discouraged if you're a big time OKR fan or in a company that runs an OKR shop. Don't feel like you've been cheated. It's good. It's a great starting place. It's just not complete. So I hope this helps you, even if it's just within your own team, right? If you're a product leader, if it's like an L2 or L3 OKR that you manage, or if you're an individual team member, an individual product manager at the L4 level, where you're coming up with OKRs for your product team, or you're collectively building those together, right? I hope you can plug some of these things in to get more clarity with your team. And then as you see the results and the fruit of that effort, be able to influence the rest of your organization to add some of the strategy kernel into your OKR development, so you have more of a holistic picture and have more coherence of action across the organization. So with that, thanks for joining me today. Again, if you're on the audio podcast, which I know most of you are, head over to the Path to Product YouTube channel. You can get the slides. I'll have them posted in the YouTube video, and you can watch it over again, share it out with somebody. I wish you a happy holidays and a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year's. The next episode after this will probably come in the new year. I'll be taking a little bit of break. Well, from podcasting, I'll be finishing my book, working on releasing Never Assume the Top 10 Assumptions Great Product Managers Never Make. So if you're into reading, there will be an audio book at some point, but the first one will be a ebook, paperback, and hardcover. So if you're into reading and you like product management content, there's a good one coming to you probably middle of Q1, maybe late Q1, depending on how editing goes. But if you would like to get an early sneak peek, provide some feedback, email me at john@pathtoproduct.io, and I'd be happy to send you an early draft as I'm working on the editing and whatnot. So with that said, it's great having you again in this last episode of 2021. I will see you in the new year. Have a blessed and safe holiday season.